Hill Communication Studies 100. This is Matt Simpson, and for my informational speech, I'm going to be giving it on hydroelectric energy. We're at the beginning of an energy crisis where we've realized that the resource that we've been using the most, which is coal and fossil fuels, is not as abundant as we thought. We have realized that there is an end. At the moment, there's no end in sight, but we know that it's coming up. It's taking hundreds of thousands to millions of years to create all these resources, and we're using them at an astonishingly fast rate. There are other resources that we've been looking into, some of them much more efficient than others, some of them much more abundant than others. For example, solar energy, if you go to a place where it's sunny 95% of the time, it's pretty efficient and it's very abundant, but the solar panels are expensive to create, and aside from the environmental benefits, it's not very worth it. There's also nuclear energy, which is if you take an atom and split it apart, it's fission. If you take atoms and throw them together, create new ones, it's fusion. Those are really efficient forms. However, there are repercussions, as you guys have heard of Chernobyl, and there was the breakdown a couple years ago in Japan, the Fukushima Daiichi plant that overheated because of the tsunami that hit Japan. There's also wind energy, which in places like Ellensburg, where it's really windy, are extremely efficient, but here not so much. It would be awesome to put a bunch of these in valleys, but they're incredibly expensive, and for the cost of them, not very worth it. Hydroelectric energy, though, is my all-time favorite form of energy, just because it's taking something that's naturally occurring. The gravity is constantly pulling water downhill, and it takes the kinetic energy that's formed by it and transfers that into electricity. And most people only know of one form of hydroelectric energy, but there's three main ones. The first one would be tidal, which is you take off the coast, you put a turbine in the water, and as the tide comes in, it pushes it. As the tide goes out, it pushes it the other way, and it generates electricity. However, only about 90% of the time, 75% of the time, more like, the turbines are actually spinning. When it gets close to high tide and when it gets close to low tide, it's not moving very much. But when the tides are changing fairly rapidly, that's when it's really effective. The other form is diversion, which is you make a stream off of a river, spin it through a turbine, and spit it back out into the river, which doesn't harm fish habitats at all. It doesn't change their spawning courses, but it does destroy the resources that are there when the plant is put in. It does take out trees, and there is the power lines that need to go to civilization, which can take up some resources. The one that people know most about, though, is impoundment, and that's when you completely block off a river and you make a reservoir behind it. And then after that reservoir is in place, you pour water from it in mass quantities through a turbine, spins the turbines, and generates electricity. This one is extremely efficient. In Washington State, about 90% of our energy comes from hydroelectric, and about 90% of that energy comes from the Grand Coulee Dam. And from that statistic, I took an EPA statistic on how much hydroelectric energy was produced in Washington, and I took a statistic from the Public Utilities Department in Electric City, which is where the Grand Coulee Dam is placed. Just divided that out, and it came to about 90%. It does have some pretty drastic repercussions, though. It's terrible for fish spawning unless you have a fish ladder. implemented, which this is what a fish ladder is. It pretty much takes a stream of water from the bottom of the dam, and this one, it's just an S curve constantly, and it allows them to get from one side of the dam to the other. But fish ladders also, they do change the course of the fish spawn, and it also changes the wildlife that would feed on those fish. Like, for instance, bears would normally hunt in fairly shallow rivers. Well, guess what? Where that river was, there's now a lake. Pretty drastic change. Also, all the trees that were in where that lake is, those have to be logged or destroyed, and all the wildlife that was depending on those trees is gone, either dead or have had to move. So it is disrupting the habitat. However, there are some pretty good effects from it. Like I said, it's the most efficient form of hydroelectric. And also there are other types of fish ladders. Like that one's just an S weaving in and out until it gets to the bottom. Sorry, my cat just sneezed. Some of them are separate platforms that the fish would like swim from one and jump to the other. So it doesn't destroy the fish spawning habitats. It's kind of a nuisance for them. And every single form of energy has its cons. For wind energy, those things will chop up a bird faster than if you took a meat cleaver to it. For solar energy, it's not very efficient. I mean, if there's clouds, it doesn't produce much energy. So it would be pointless to have one in Port Angeles. But hydroelectric is taking something that's pretty much always going to be there. The water is going to evaporate from the sea. It's going to rain in the mountains, and the mountains, with it being higher in elevation than the sea, it's going to have that water flow into streams, which is going to create kinetic energy. And with that kinetic energy, we just take some of the movement out and spin a turbine, and our lights come on. The Elwha Dam that was here, it generated enough electricity to power the mill that was in town. That is in town. It's still here. But also, there was no fish ladder at the Elwha Dam. Instead, it was two separate ecosystems, and the fish from the upper dam had never had any contact with the fish from the lower dam after it was built. Really messed up fish spawns, because fish that would go down to the ocean no longer had any access to it. Which most dams do not have fish ladders. The Grand Coulee doesn't even have a fish ladder. But like I said, any form of energy has its repercussions. The form that we're using now has an immense amount of carbon dioxide emissions. Terrible for the environment, contributing to the hole in the ozone. And the repercussions for hydroelectric they do have a long-term effect, but it just depends on whether or not you think changing fish habitats is worse than destroying the atmosphere. It could go either way. The atmosphere is not in any immediate danger, and it'll be there tomorrow. It'll be there next week. It might get worse. It might get better, but that just depends on how we change our actions. As for tidal energy, it pretty much the only negative parts is it's not all that efficient, and it's not. They do have gates over the turbines, but there's still microorganisms in the oceans that could get chopped up. And for diversion, there's also the resources to build the plant. It doesn't change fish spawns at all. The river's still there. It's just got a little bit of a loop in it. So personally I say if it's an alternative to destroying our atmosphere, I say we should invest in alternative energies, and hydroelectric impoundment is a fantastic one to go through. Just because of how efficient it is, and besides damming off a reservoir or damming off a river, it's a pretty good way to go. Also, without that Grand Coulee Dam, there would not be an entire town. The entire town of Electric City is below the dam, so it's pretty important there. So, if we keep burning fossil fuels, we'll eventually run out. But hydroelectric energy, the water cycle is going to be there until all of our water is no longer water. And even then, any sort of liquid, we would be able to harness. One of my friends was developing a little mini hydroelectric generator that you would put in your gutter. So as the rainfall would come, it would generate electricity. Not a whole lot, but the kinetic energy it's there. Why not use it? All right, thank you guys for listening to my speech, and have a good day.